This woman attempted to go undercover at an insane asylum, but little did she know that this would end up being the biggest mistake of her life, while also being the most important one. The research and stories that she gleaned from this situation paved the way for legislation and care for insane patients at insane asylums in the future. This is the story of Nellie Bly and the horrors that these women experienced in the late 1800s when most of them were not even insane. Welcome to episode 3 of Obscure History, where we delve into the madness and evil of insane asylums in the late 1800s. Like and subscribe and hit the bell icon for all notifications if you like this content. Nellie Bly was born as Elizabeth Jane Cochran in 1864 to parents Michael Cochran and Mary Jane Kennedy. She was one of 15 children, and she was the third to last born and the 13th girl. Michael was previously married before that marriage and had most of his children with his first wife. Her father was a laborer and then a mill worker, and then he purchased a farmhouse, and then he bought the mill close to the farmhouse and ended up owning a lot of land. But he would die in 1870 when Elizabeth was only 6 years old. Elizabeth's nickname was Pink when she was a little girl. She actually kept that nickname all the way until she was about 18 years old, mostly because she wore the color so often, and she was very much a girly girl. Also, when she was a teenager, she added an E to the end of Cochran, although she never truly elaborated why. Could have been daddy issues from a young age, but he had been gone for a long time, so we don't truly know. But from a very young age, she was known as a outspoken and charismatic young woman, and she was a natural-born leader, and she had this really powerful way of swaying others with her passion and her charisma. So when in 1885, the Pittsburgh Dispatch released a column called "What Girls Are Good For," and the context of this article was that girls only existed to give birth and to keep house. So Nellie responded to this article under the pseudonym of Lonely Orphan Girl, and she claimed that those insinuations were just ridiculous, and women offer so much more and should have the ability to choose what they want to do with their lives. While the prevailing opinion at the time was people were against that, the editor, George Madden, he actually liked her passion so much that he offered her a job to write for the newspaper. And this led to her first ever piece called The Girl Puzzle, which stated that women really shouldn't need to marry and that they should have affordable, better job opportunities for them in the workplace. And as you can imagine, this struck a note with women readers. Sometime after this, Elizabeth changed her name to Nellie Bly as her pen name for journalism, which was very common during that time period. Her writing branched into reform of divorce laws, and ultimately George Madden was so impressed again that he offered her a full-time position with the newspaper. But as she delved further into writing articles about factory workers that were being mistreated, as you can imagine, the factory owners started to complain to the newspaper. And because they had so much pull and sway in society at the time, she ended up relegated to fashion and gardening and talk about society. Of course, she did not like this because she wanted to make a difference in the world. So she decided to go where she could actually make a bigger impact, and that was actually down in Mexico. She served there as a foreign correspondent. She was reporting on the lives and the customs of the Mexican people. But once again, she got very controversial, as she regularly stood up against the political leaders at the time who were treating the people badly. At one point, she protested the imprisonment of a local journalist by the Mexican government. The dictator at the time, who was in charge of this, Porfirio Diaz, who she said was a dictator, he ultimately threatened for her arrest, and so that caused her to have to flee back to America. Back home in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh Dispatch, she got stuck working on these theater and art exposés, so she got bored and needed to change the scenery again, so she moved to New York City. But the problem in New York City was that news editors refused to hire women. For 4 months, she was actually completely broke and wandering the streets and begging for work. Somehow, because she is a charismatic woman, she was able to talk her way into the New York World, which was a publication at the time. She got that job because she agreed to work some of the most ridiculous undercover cases of all time. Right off the bat, her first ever case, which she fully agreed to, was that she needed to go undercover in an insane asylum to investigate reports of brutality and neglect. But this meant that she had to pretend to be insane, which definitely is harder than it seems. But she believed enough in her acting skills that she felt like she could accomplish her mission and remain pretending to be insane as long as possible. And so this was her big break, because she really wanted to make a difference, and this was her moment, because she believed that the insane were God's most helpless creatures, and she wanted to make sure that they were cared for kindly and appropriately. So risks be damned, she was going to do it no matter what. She assumed the pseudonym name as Nellie Brown. She began to teach herself how to try to pretend to be insane. Her plan was to check herself into the temporary homes for females. It's a boarding house. She figured that her best way of getting committed to the Blackwell Insane Asylum was by convincing a bunch of women in a house that she was crazy, because if she was weird enough, they'd want to get her removed somehow. She stayed up all night beforehand to give herself this wide-eyed, bloodshot look. She wanted to appear as a disturbed woman. She kind of just let her hair go crazy, and she started practicing weird diatribes in the mirror. The next day, she went to the boarding house and she rang the doorbell at the front door. The door opened really suddenly, with a vengeance, as a little angry 13-year-old girl answered it, and she rudely asked her, "What do you want?" Nellie asked if the matron was in, and the little girl said that the matron was in the back, but she's busy. So Nellie wanders into this dimly lit parlor. It was very dark and uncomfortable. An older woman approached her, and she said that she was the matron's assistant, and she asked her what she wanted. So Nellie just said that she wanted to stay for a few days, and the matron's assistant said that they don't have enough rooms, but she could stay with another woman for 30 cents a day. Nellie paid for one night, and she decided to just sit still for a while to take stock of the area. Beyond the dark room, she was able to see a few chairs and wardrobes, but the environment was very sad, and the inhabitants appeared even sadder. An hour later, the dinner bell rang, and she shuffled behind all these dreary-looking women. As they all sat down and got ready to eat, she resumed her people watching to try to understand these women. She needed to be able to convince them, with authority, that she deserved to be in an insane asylum. She noticed one mother sitting casually, just reading while her boy Georgie was causing a lot of problems. Another snored really loudly in a chair, and she kept waking herself up. Some of them were lacing and knitting incessantly, and this caused her to come up with a plan in her head for how she was going to do this. After a few more hours, the matron's assistant came back up to her and said, "Why are you so quiet? Are you feeling sorrowful?" asking if she's depressed. And Nellie wanted to give off this feeling of like being delusional, so she said that yes, everything was just so sad, and she said it in like a haphazard way, gazing her eyes to the side to just appear like she was losing it. And the assistant said, like, "That shouldn't really worry you. What are you planning to do for work here if you're all alone?" Nellie's response was always just, "I don't know," to every question that she asked, and then she just kept saying, "But everything's just so sad. It's just so sad." The assistant kept saying, "But you need to learn how to do work here if you're gonna survive." Nellie said that, "I can't. All the women here are crazy. Did you notice all these women here? They're so crazy." And she was just saying how everyone around her is just so insane. And she said that there's been all these murders and the police need to do something about that. After a few of these, she just started bawling her eyes out on command, which was impressive, by the way. This kind of spooked the matron's assistant, and she left. And Nellie picked out two of the women that she had been observing and said that these were the two most gregarious, sociable women. These are the ones that are gonna lead and help me get put away. So she approached these two women and told them that she was lonely. She only responded to all their prompts with yes or no, or I don't know answers. She just looked as sad as possible. Eventually, the maid came and said it was time for everybody to go to bed. And this is where Nellie decided to cause her scene. She just put up a fight immediately. She said, "No, I will not go to bed. I cannot go to bed in this place because all these women here are crazy." But she eventually let them take her up to her bed. A good-hearted woman named Mrs. Kane came and sat next to her and tried to calm her down. She was brushing her hair, but Nellie would have none of it. She remained panicked and wide-eyed. She kept accusing the others in the hallway of being dangerous and scary. Several women kept passing by the room and looking at her and being like, who is this crazy loon? One of them actually thought that Nellie was so crazy that she might unalive them by morning. But Mrs. Kane was a sweet woman. She sat with Nellie and she kept asking her questions about her life, trying to console her. Nellie said she didn't remember anything about her life because of the headache, just the headache. This really saddened Mrs. Kane, and she tried her best. This is why Nellie actually started to feel bad. She's like, oh my gosh, this is actually a nice woman. What am I doing? Sometime in the night, there was actually a scream in the other room. One of the women had a nightmare that Nellie was gonna unalive her. She had a dream that Nellie had a knife and was coming to attack her. And so Nellie knew that her ploy was working. She was intent on keeping it up all night. She wanted to get there as fast as possible. Even though it was very hard to stay awake, she managed to do it the whole night. In the morning, Mrs. Kane was concerned for her, so she kept her upstairs while everybody went down for breakfast. And she asked Nellie, like, where are your friends? Who do you have to take care of you? And Nellie said she had no friends. She said all she had were trunks. Where were they? She needed to get her trunks, which I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't know what that means. I'm guessing suitcases, but like, if any of y'all know, let me know. She could tell that Mrs. Kane thought that she was insane, but Mrs. Kane still chastised all these other women for saying these negative things to Nellie. But Nellie kept pushing the envelope, and she demanded that her trunks be returned. Well, the matron's assistant had had enough. She went off to the police station, grabbed two police officers, and said, hey, this woman's crazy. I need you to escort her out of here. The police officers then brought her to the chief of police with the matron's assistant. To the matron's assistant's case, she actually tried to plead for Nellie by saying that she was just a poor, crazy woman who had probably been driven insane by inhumane treatment. The police chief agreed, all right, I'll help Nellie find her trunks. So they escorted her to the courtroom to talk to a judge, because we gotta figure out who this woman is and what we need to do with her. The judge said that they needed to get some reporters to try to ferret out the truth, but Nellie knew this would be bad because she did not want nosy people butting in and ruining her cover. So she said, no, I need my trunks. If you don't help me, I will leave. One of the officers who had brought her to the chief had said, she's clearly crazy. We need to send her to the insane asylum. But actually the matron's assistant argued against that and said, no, she's a woman. time, that would unalive her. And so Nellie got upset with this woman, even though she had good intentions, because she was ruining her ploy. The judge's ruling was that she must have been drugged. He was going to send her to Bellevue to wait until the drugs wore off so they could find out who she was. She needed to come up with an alibi, quick. The judge once again asked her, like, where is she from? She's like, oh, I'm from Cuba. She even spoke a little bit of Spanish, which as a white woman, I just don't understand that during that time period at least. But okay. So once she gave him a few details about her life, he was like, all right, I guess you can stay in the courtroom. He canceled asking for the reporters, which was a huge relief to her. But the guy who came and brought the reporters said, well, clearly she can't be insane if she's rejecting journalists. So Nellie sighed and was like, God damn, they keep going against what I'm trying to do here. She stood up and just yelled and just turned to everyone and said, why do you bother me with so many people? I want my trunks. And so their next step was they called in a surgeon to see her, but she was combative and didn't want to be seen. Noticing her dilated eyes because she had been up all night, he asked her what drugs she had been taking. She said she doesn't know what drugs even are. The doctor was convinced she was taking belladonna, which was actually a fashion thing back in the time that women would do to increase the dilation of their eyes to make them appear to be more attractive or beautiful. Strange, I know. She demanded that she be released. He said they should be nicer to her like the judge has been. But the doctor demanded that she be taken in an ambulance to Bellevue because he figured something might actually be seriously wrong with her. At this point, Nellie was pretty convinced that her ploy was working because a crowd had gathered behind the ambulance as they took her in. Everybody wanted to see the new crazy girl. She was taken to an office. A bunch of men started asking her more questions and she just refused to answer. So the men got frustrated. One of the men grabbed to go take her to the insane ward and she screamed and said, don't touch me. I will only go where the surgeon takes me. The surgeon agreed and said, all right, fine, I'll just take you there myself. And this was just a little ward that had a boat near it that would take the insane to the island, but they had to be assessed first to see if they could go to the island. She met a few other women here that were also potentially going to be taken to the island. One of them, Miss Ann Neville, was only there because her health was failing. Immediately, Nellie could tell that she was not insane at all. She was just sick, but the doctors were having none of it. Once settled into the insane ward, she began to notice how incredibly cold it was. And the other women that were staying there had only nightgowns on. All the nurses had these heavy coats and shawls to protect themselves, and Nellie found that strange. She complained about this to the nurses. The nurses said this was a charity, and that she was lucky that she's getting any help at all. So when it came to examine her and determine if she should be sent to the island or not, the doctor asked her, was she selling herself on the streets? Because he couldn't fathom why she didn't have a man. She was disgusted. But then he told her that she needs to be more available to men so that they can keep her. She tempered her anger and just acted confused to try to keep up her disguise. He declared that she was a hopeless case and needed to go to the island, so she won. At night, she was forced to undress and had to wear the same nightgown that all the other women were wearing. The night got colder and colder and she struggled to stay warm. And the nurses constantly chatted all night long, keeping the patients awake. They regularly patrolled the hallways loudly. Cries could be heard from the men's ward as well, and that was keeping them up at night. For breakfast, they had a broth which tasted awful. They were subjected to more questioning. Very strange questions like, do they see faces on the walls? Or do you hear voices? A doctor even made a pass at her at one point and said that if you agree to be my property, I'll rescue you from here, which was crazy. That next day, they brought in a new woman named Miss Tilly, who became Nellie's friend. And when she realized she was in an insane ward, she thought there must be some sort of mistake. Her friends were supposed to be helping her deal with a nervous debility, and the doctors assured her, no, you're in the right place. So she was rather confused. The longer that Nellie stayed there, she became very nervous that she was going to get found out. She just kept providing inconsistencies with her story to try to make sure that she would get sent there. Because she saw these other women that were confused, she was like wondering, do these women really need to go to the insane asylum? Because she hadn't seen anyone visibly insane yet. She was boarded onto the boat to head to the island, and she was starting to notice clear signs of problems at this point. The women that were being sent to the island, they all had to sit down and not move. And if any of them tried to get up or move, the nurses would yell at them, push them back down. So that became rather scary. As soon as she got onto Blackwell Island and got inside the doors of the insane asylum, and the doors bolted shut behind her, Nellie started to feel this sense of infinite dread. The other women around her were also terrified, and that permeated the atmosphere, and the smells of the place were horrible. Every hallway just had this disgusting stench. And so Nellie felt this fear. She was like, oh shoot, what if I never get out of here? Her fears were further confirmed when she met a German woman, Mrs. Louise Schanz. She didn't speak a word of English, and she was trying to speak her case to the doctor about how she didn't need to be in this insane asylum. The doctor went and fetched a nurse that knew a few German words, and the nurse didn't know enough to be able to translate what the woman was saying. And so their immediate reaction was, well, just admit her. She must be crazy if she's being sent here. So she got sent in without being able to defend herself. For lunch that day, Nellie was served gruel, and then afterwards she was sent to the bath to be scrubbed vigorously in an ice bath, and the gruel was disgusting. The ice bath was painful. Another woman who became one of her good friends, Miss Mayard, was plunged into this ice bath even though she was very, very sick. She complained about this sickness, but they said that they'd beat her if she continued with that. When it was Nellie's time to be assessed, the doctor barely asked her any questions. He just spent the whole time laughing with the nurse about her recent vacation. Then Nellie was admitted without a word and never given a chance to defend herself. Not that she was going to. After the bath, Nellie was taken down to her bed. She was forced to lay down on her bed in only a shift. She's still soaking wet, and that transferred the cold down into the bed, where it was already freezing. She complained once again, and the nurse once again said, "This is charity. You are lucky that you get anything." The bedroom consisted of a twin bed with one sheet and a pillow and a barred window, and that was it. There's nothing else in there. The next morning, she was woken up forcefully, forced to remove her clothes, and put on this drab dress. All the women were taken into one room. Their hair was combed vigorously. They had no concern for the well-being of this woman. It was extremely painful, and all Nellie could do was just grin and bear it. Miss Mayard actually had her own comb that she asked to use, but the nurse wouldn't allow it, threw away her comb, and said, "No, we're using these combs." For lunch, they were only given hard pieces of black bread, which were clearly stale. To add more fuel to the fire, Nellie found a spider in hers. Yeah. This is when Nellie started to realize the true extent of the problems here. For that day, the patients then had to go about and clean everything, including the nurses' rooms, and prepping and taking care of the nurses' clothing, which they had coats and shawls. Once again, they could handle the cold. And Nellie was baffled because she was like, "I thought the nurses would do this work because they're supposed to take care of these patients, but really these patients are slaves for the nurses." And the highlight of their day was they got to go outside with a shawl and a hat. All the women got excited for this because this was their one moment to do anything, period. Nellie just felt so bad for the patients because they had this skirmish for the hats. They all wanted to grab whatever hat that they wanted, and that was their moment. The only time they could feel any type of satisfaction there. This is the first time that Nellie saw patients from the extreme ward. They were actually connected to a rope chain, which was attached to a heavy iron cart, which attached all the women to each other. Some of those women were just sobbing uncontrollably. Some of them were nursing pretty serious injuries to legs, hips, you name it. One was yelling at one of the other nurses there and said that that nurse was going to unalive her if she kept doing this to her. So these women were horribly battered and bruised, and Nellie had no idea what was happening to them. Her dinner meal consisted of boiled fish, just fish chunks that they threw in water and boiled, no seasoning. The nurses ate at a nearby table with grapes, melons, white bread, and seasoned meats right in front of them. When the patients complained, the nurses told them to shut up. These nurses regularly ate raisins, grapes, apples, crackers in front of them all the time. Those were considered luxuries to these women, and then they laughed at the patients when the patients couldn't have access to any of them. At one point during that dinner, Miss Mayard got really sick from the food she was eating. She ran out of the room to throw up, but she got scolded for this and whacked aside the head. That next night, Nellie went to bed and was just shell-shocked by the experience that she was going through. She didn't know it was going to be this bad. One woman spent the whole night begging for God to just let her die because of the cold. And there were some others that just yelled all night long, and maybe those ones were truly insane. That next morning, the woman who begged for God to let her die was taken out. She was an older woman. She sat down on a bench, and she kept asking for a shawl because she was just so cold. Every time she moved, they just forced her back into the bench. Eventually, they just kind of let her wander about, and she was bumping into things, and they were laughing at her because she kept bumping into everything. One of the nurses put her cold hands on the woman just to make her more cold. The other nurses thought that that was hilarious as she squirmed in pain. During this day, Miss Mayard's condition worsened, and the doctor brought her into a room and simply just pinched her forehead repeatedly and was squeezing her head. And this was intended to relieve her delusions. Nellie realized very quickly that this actually just kind of drove the woman to insanity. So you had women coming in here that were perfectly fine, just sick, that the doctors and nurses actually made insane by feeding into their delusions as an excuse to keep them there to essentially just be their work slaves. Later that day, a gentleman came in who had known Nellie for many years. He wanted to speak to Nellie and see why was she in there. This terrified Nellie. She's like, oh my gosh, my cover's gonna get blown again. Once he got brought into the room with her, she was able to sneak a whisper at him and said, please don't give me away. And luckily, he understood. He's like, wait a second, this is weird. Why would she say that to me? The nurse asked Nellie, do you know this man? Nellie's like, no, I've never seen this man in my life. The nurse asked the man, do you know Nellie? He unconvincingly said, no, I don't know this woman. Sorry, I must have been mistaken. So luckily, Nellie got away again. In her time there in that insane asylum, she actually met and talked with 45 different women that she reported about, some of which had more interesting stories than others, most of which were clearly not insane. The way these nurses were sadistic is they would pick out the insecurities of some of these women and just hit home on them to try to make them appear worse than they actually were. One girl who had come in, her name was Urena Littlepage. She was only 18 years old. She was very insecure about her age and her her looks, because apparently she looked a lot older. So all the doctors and nurses would just joke around, like, oh, Urena, are you sure you're 18? The doctor said that you were 33. And then the nurses would laugh about it. And it seems kind of minuscule, but there were just minor things that these women were really upset about, and that just made her really angry. This would cause this girl to cry because of her appearance, and they would hit her and tell her to stop, but that just made her cry harder. The nurses would ultimately choke her until she was quiet, and the marks on her neck would be there the whole day afterwards. The interesting thing about this punishment that they administered, though, is that it actually made the nurses want to do it more. Nellie observed that, like, once they did it once, they had a propensity to want to keep doing it. They wanted to keep the cruelty going. And so there was this woman called Mrs. Grady. She was actually insane. She muttered and talked to herself constantly. They considered her like the most annoying patient because she just wouldn't stop. Whenever they got that itch, they just used her and beat her because she was an easy target. They'd take her into a closet and repeatedly beat her until she stopped muttering and just ended up completely silent. Every time they came up and touched her, she always just begged. She said, please stop beating me. Please stop beating me. I'll be good. I'll be good. And that is just, that's tough. Another woman, a French woman, Josephine Despreux, she was admitted because one morning during breakfast, she just got really sick one day. She got very delirious due to this sickness, as that can happen when you're sick. Her husband was concerned. He's like, my wife is delirious. What's going on here? So he called the police and said, hey, something's wrong with her. I gotta help her. The next thing she knew, she was taken away from her husband and kids. She woke up the next day in the insane asylum, never to find out what actually happened and why they put her there. She would cry and cry and cry for days, missing her family. But once again, the nurses would just choke her until she was quiet again. Another thing that was really common was women would apply for aid because they were penniless. They had nothing. This would cause them to get interred in the insane asylum. That's it. That's all it took. That was a surprisingly easy way to get cheap labor. Another woman, she just went by the name Margaret. She was a cook and she was very obsessed with cleanliness, and she wanted everything to be so clean. When some of the chambermaids where she was working soiled the floor on purpose because they thought it was funny, a quarrel broke out. She got so angry with them. She's like, how can you do this? Because they did it on purpose. The cops were called, they brought in, and they determined Margaret was clearly insane for being such a clean freak. And so she was admitted. Sometimes at night, they would actually force the patients to take laudanum to keep them calm, which that's a painkiller and sleep aid, which is supposed to keep delusional patients calm, but it's a mixture of like opium and alcohol, which I don't think that's healthy. Nellie did not trust this substance, so when they tried to give to her, she refused. She's like, no, I don't want to take that. Why would I want to take that? The doctor insisted, and he says, hey, if you don't take this, I'm going to inject you with it. And so her mindset was, well, if I'm going to not take this substance, the best way to deal with it would be to take it orally and then puke it back up. So that's what she did. So she agreed, I'll take it, and then she threw it back up because she didn't trust it. I think a lot of the time she was actually kind of afraid there was some level of mind control going on. She was worried that her position would become tenuous if she started to lose or dull her senses. She was afraid then she might not be rescued, or she might become insane like some of these other women were becoming. At this time, Miss Maynard started to grow worse and worse. She started to sing to herself to help her regain her memory because she was losing her memory. The nurses did not like this, so they would continue the beatings and she would get worse. One of the worst punishments that they tended to inflict on the patients was they would put a sheet around the girl's head and they tied it super tight so that she couldn't scream. They would hold her underwater until the woman kind of gave up hope and became senseless. At one point in time, a girl actually died from this, and the doctors put in the report that she just died of convulsions. One morning, Nellie was talking to another girl. She said, I dreamed of my mother last night. I think she may come today and take me home. This really crushed Nellie's psyche because this longing was really the only thing these women had. This hope and dream that there is a way or a scenario that they will get out someday. And it was a hopeless scenario because she knew these women were never going to get out. But of course, she's not going to tell them that, like, no, you're not going to get out. She had to encourage their delusions because it's all they had. It's the only thing they had going for them. And that's just so incredibly sad. She watched these women as they ate and they breathed and they lived, but they weren't even truly alive. She slowly watched the light from their eyes just disappear day by day, and they just became shells of their former selves. She firmly believed that it's like, well, these women might not have been insane when they came in, but you can make them more insane, clearly. The other highlights of their days was when they received these letters, or one woman would receive a letter every month or so, and everyone crowded around it like it was the biggest spectacle ever. To hear news of the outside world was just crazy to them. It was just this mind-blowing experience because they didn't get any of that. And to make her experiment more believable, Nellie actually behaved sane the entire time she was there. She might have behaved insane to get there, but when she was in, she's like, well, I'm just gonna be normal and see how I get treated. And yet, every time she professed to be sane, the nurses never believed her. After all these experiences, Nellie actually did intend to get transferred to the violent wards because she wanted to get the full experience to know what these women truly went through. But after hearing from two sane women who had been in there and told about their experiences there, she came to the conclusion that this was a massive risk to her health and safety. She could never complete the full experiment. She never actually got to know how bad it was in the worst parts of the asylum. Once it got towards the close of the time she allotted to spend there, she actually tried to get herself into a quieter hall. Even though the nurses didn't believe her, she did find one doctor who was willing to put her in a quieter, safer area for the last couple days, and so she was transferred into Hall 7, and while the treatment was better, she actually was locked up with 6 other women. 2 of them spent the whole night ranting and raving. One of them crawled around on her hands and knees, consistently was saying she was searching for someone to unalive. And it just struck Nellie as fascinating how any one of them could have just died there, but luckily that woman never struck. Soon after being transferred to the new hall, a lawyer did eventually come in on behest of her newspaper, and he said that she had some friends that were actually going to be able to take care of her. That convinced the asylum to release her because he was an influential lawyer, and so she was finally freed. But there were moments there where she thought, am I ever gonna get out of this place? I don't know, but luckily her newspaper came through and saved her the way that they needed to. Immediately upon release, she took the asylum to court. She went straight to a judge and said, I need to get these women out of here, or at least give them better conditions. Many of the nurses were brought to the court to give their testimonies, which of course they gave conflicting testimonies to everything she said, so she knew she was in for a battle here. Big shocker there, of course they're gonna lie. And she actually returned to the island with the jurors to try to see the scenario and situation for themselves to be able to truly judge it. Of course, this time around when Nellie went with them, the boat was super clean, completely spotless. The nurses were incredibly nice, whereas when she went, the nurses were cruel and the boat was incredibly dirty. When she finally got to the island, the halls were spotless, the bedrooms were upgraded with nice stuff in it, like armoires and chairs, and they looked really nice. The kitchen was immaculate, and that had been one of the dirtiest places, and they were serving warm bread and this fancy soup, as well as different types of meats to the jurors as they came in. It just became silly how hard they were just trying to appear normal. Even worse, all the problematic patients were completely removed from the area. So all of her friends, the ones that had been doing the worst, like Miss Maynard and the woman who muttered to herself all the time and was beaten regularly, they were nowhere to be found. There were only a few patients here and there. Luckily, Nellie did have a few friends inside who were willing to corroborate her story. Specifically, Miss Ann Neville had been considered a low-risk patient, but she was able to provide a stunning testimony to the jurors to be like, this place is horrible. Nellie knows what she's talking about, and she was able to give clear descriptions and show how sane and normal she was. There were a few others that really helped with the story. But even after all this, Nellie actually felt like all hope was lost because she just couldn't express to them how bad it was because all they were seeing were these good things going on. A few testimonies, she thought that wasn't going to be able to pull it, and she was so afraid everything was going to fall apart, all of her hard work to get these women safe. But apparently the exhibition had been pretty convincing. The jury awarded the victory to Nellie. The city of New York agreed to pay $1 million per year, which was a lot of money back then, towards care for the insane. It was a landslide. She eventually published this as a report, which became a book later on called 10 Days in a Madhouse, which is where I'm getting most of this information from now. Nellie Bly actually gained celebrity status for this type of work at the time period. She was huge and influential and pioneering for women. In 1888, she was actually able to convince her editor to take a trip around the world to break the record for fastest time around the world. She also did most of that journey by herself, and she broke the record. It was later broken again in a few months, but still very impressive for the time period. She met a lot of famous people along the way. Eventually, she got the chance to interview the insane serial killer Lizzie Halliday, which is another topic for another day. She wrote a lot of fascinating stories about the places she visited and the people that she wanted to help, and how insane people are actually sometimes sane. She ended up getting a lucrative job after that, writing serial novels for the New York Family Story paper. In 1895, she ended up marrying her husband, Robert Seaman. He was 73 and she was only 31 at the time. Keep in mind, guys, she's 31 at this point after all these things she's already done. Due to his failing health quickly after that, she took over his business, which was the Ironclad Manufacturing Company. They made steel containers. He died in 1904, and she actually came up with many inventions for her company too over the years. For a short time, she was one of the leading female industrialists of that entire time period. This is a woman who has many different hats, but it wasn't really her passion running this company, and she neglected it quite a bit. Due to this negligence, one or several of her factory managers actually got involved in embezzlement, which actually led to a very costly and protracted bankruptcy case and litigation, which ultimately took her company down. In 1913, she got hired to the New York Evening Journal. She covered women's suffrage for quite a while. She accurately predicted that women would get the right to vote in a few years, and which was true in 1920. Not only that, but she also wrote stories on the Eastern Front of World War I, becoming the first ever woman to visit this section of the front and to cover it. She was actually arrested while she was there for being mistaken for a British spy, even though she was just a journalist. She was eventually released after the war. She died in 1922 of pneumonia at the age of 57 in St. Mark's Hospital in New York City. And that, my friends, is the story of Nellie Bly. Now, this woman, there are so many other topics that I could have covered. Maybe I'll do those for future videos, but like, I wanted to focus on the insane asylum story today because I thought it was the most fascinating, but this woman led a multicultured, dynamic, powerful life. That's why she's my subject of obscure history today, another person that I feel like needs to be talked about more for her contributions to society. Thanks for listening. I want to continue to hope to do these episodes weekly. I think there's a lot of other fascinating characters out there that you guys need to hear about, and I hope you guys stick around. So please like and subscribe if you like this content, and make sure to hit the bell notification to get all notifications, and I hope to see you guys around.